The Rose Petal Murders. A story by Tim Maxwell. Chapter 1. Winter's Bite. Gotham lay buried under a thick blanket of snow. The city's lights fought against the darkness, flickering weakly beneath the heavy storm clouds that loomed overhead. Icy winds howled through the empty streets, whistling between the towering buildings that made up Gotham's skyline. It was a night where the city's most resilient souls stayed inside, hidden from the unforgiving cold. But not Lieutenant Jim Gordon. Gordon stood at the entrance of a luxury penthouse in the heart of Gotham's wealthiest district, staring at the snow-covered streets below. His breath rose in clouds of mist as he adjusted his collar, trying in vain to block the wind's bite. Behind him, the flash of red and blue police lights bathed the penthouse lobby in a morbid glow, the crime scene a stark contrast to the wealth and opulence surrounding him. The door to the penthouse was ajar, and Gordon hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. Inside, the warmth of the penthouse did nothing to alleviate the chill creeping through his veins. The scene before him was grim. Martha Delacour, one of Gotham's most powerful and influential figures, sat dead in the center of the room. She was tied to an ornate leather chair, her body slumped forward, head hanging lifelessly. Her wrists and ankles were bound, red marks visible on her pale skin, a testament to her struggle before death. Dried blood matted her once perfect hair. Gordon's eyes traveled to her chest, where a single blood-red rose petal lay delicately atop her lifeless form. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had done this had entered Martha's life with precision, leaving no trace behind except for the carnage they'd caused. Gordon stood frozen, his mind racing. His gut told him that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was too clean, too deliberate. This was a message, but one Gordon couldn't quite decipher. The sound of movement behind him didn't startle him. He knew who it was before he even turned around. A shadow moved in the dimly lit penthouse, a figure blending seamlessly with the darkness. Batman had arrived, as silent and unyielding as the night. Gordon didn't speak. He didn't need to. The caped figure moved with purpose, stepping into the room as if he were a part of it, a predator in his natural environment. Batman's eyes were fixed on the body, taking in the gruesome details with a cold, calculating gaze. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, as though the weight of Gotham's sins had been drawn to him, as they always were. Martha Delacour had been no stranger to controversy. As the CEO of Delacourt Industries, she had built her empire through ruthless ambition, cutting down anyone who stood in her way. Her latest project had only fueled that fire. The company had been developing a new psychiatric drug, Serapax, meant to treat severe mental health conditions. But whispers of corruption had spread like wildfire in recent months. Deaths had been linked to the drug, lawsuits were piling up, and Gotham's media had been relentless in their coverage of the scandal. Martha, of course, had remained defiant, her public statements as cold and calculated as her business practices. Now, her enemies had outmaneuvered her in the deadliest way. Batman moved closer to the body, crouching beside the chair to examine the rose petal. His mind raced through possibilities. A rose petal, symbolic and deliberate, was not a typical calling card. There was more to this than a mere murder. This was a signal, a connection to something far deeper. The underworld had its own language, its own codes. Batman had learned them all. He knew he had to act fast. The trail was already cold, but there were threads to pull. Martha's death wasn't just an isolated event, it was the tip of a much larger iceberg. He thought of her enemies, Michael Graves, her ex-husband, who had been embroiled in a bitter divorce that left him nearly bankrupt. Then there was Victor Radcliffe, a rival in the pharmaceutical industry whose company had been pushed to the brink by Delacourt's rise. Both men had motives, but something about the rose petal nagged at Batman. It was too precise, too theatrical. It hinted at something far more sinister than a business feud. Gordon paced the room, his frustration evident. The political pressure on the GCPD was mounting. Gotham's elite would demand answers, and they would demand them quickly. A scandal involving someone as high-profile as Martha Delacour threatened to shake the city's already fragile order. And if the GCPD couldn't deliver, Gordon knew the consequences would be severe. But Batman was already several steps ahead, his mind assembling the pieces of the puzzle before anyone else even realized there was one. He knew Gotham's underbelly better than anyone, and he could feel the ripples this murder had sent through the city's dark corners. There were forces at work, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to strike again. Without a word, Batman disappeared into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Gordon alone in the penthouse with the grim reminder of Gotham's brutality. The weight of the night pressed down on him as he looked at Martha's lifeless form one last time. He knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere in Gotham's cold, dark streets, the next move was already being made, and Batman, ever watchful, was preparing for the storm that was to come. Chapter 2. Petals and Blood. Gotham was waking up to another day bathed in gray. The morning light filtered weakly through heavy clouds, doing little to dispel the perpetual gloom that clung to the city. The streets were wet from melted snow, and a freezing drizzle coated the windows of every high-rise with a sheen of moisture. The sun, barely visible, hung low in the sky like a dim bulb behind frosted glass. But no amount of cold or fog could mask the stench of death that seemed to permeate the city. In a dimly lit office nestled within one of Gotham's older buildings, the stillness of early morning was shattered by the buzz of police radios. The room was cramped, cluttered with stacks of paper, old photographs, and books on corruption in high places. A half-finished bottle of bourbon sat on a cluttered desk, surrounded by discarded cigarette butts. In the middle of the room, the lifeless body of Thomas Vale, a journalist known for his relentless pursuit of Gotham's secrets, was slumped over in his chair, his face contorted in the agony of his last moments. Like Martha Delacour before him, Vale's body bore the same grim signature, a single rose petal placed carefully on his chest. The marks on his wrists and the bruises around his neck told a familiar story. Torture, restraint, and finally death. His eyes were wide open, as if even in his last moments he had been searching for answers. He had been working late, as usual, no doubt chasing the story that had consumed him for months. The scandals surrounding Serapax, the psychiatric drug that had brought Delacourt's company to the brink of collapse. The connection between Vale and Delacour was undeniable. Vale had been close to publishing an expose about the drug, exposing the dangers it posed and the corruption that fueled its approval. He had already unearthed enough evidence to ruin powerful people, and that knowledge had cost him his life. Now, the question wasn't just who had killed him, but why the killer had chosen to make such a theatrical display of his death. The rose petal, delicate and symbolic, suggested a deeper game at play, a message only a few could decipher. For Batman, it was a familiar puzzle, though no less disturbing. From the shadows of Gotham's rooftops, he watched as the city slowly came to terms with the horror of Vale's death. The journalist had been working to expose the elite, the very people who thrived in the dark spaces between Gotham's broken systems. This was not a random murder. Someone had silenced Vale to keep their secrets buried, and Batman knew that whoever it was had orchestrated both killings with chilling precision. As Gotham's police swarmed Vale's office, Gordon was already deep in thought, his brow furrowed with the weight of the investigation. This wasn't just about finding a killer anymore. It was about navigating the dangerous political landscape that surrounded both deaths. The mayor had made it clear. The case needed to be closed. Quickly. Panic was growing, and with each day that passed without answers, Gotham's most powerful figures would feel the pressure mounting. They wanted this buried, and they wanted it buried fast. But Batman had a different perspective. He wasn't just following the trail of bodies, he was following the trail of minds. The rose petal was more than a calling card. It hinted at something darker, something psychological. There was someone behind these murders, pulling the strings, and they weren't just killing for revenge. They were killing with purpose. His investigation led him to a name that had long since vanished from Gotham's consciousness. Dr. Evelyn Cornell. Once a prominent psychiatrist working with Delacour, Cornell had been disgraced when it was discovered she had been experimenting on patients with mind-control drugs, bending their wills to her own. Her methods had been exposed, and in the chaos that followed, she had disappeared, presumed dead. But Batman was certain she wasn't. The precision, the psychological manipulation, it all pointed back to Cornell. Seropax, the drug at the center of everything, was based on research she had pioneered before her fall from grace. Could it be that she was still alive, working from the shadows? While Batman pursued Cornell, Gordon found himself trapped between the mayor's growing demands and the thinning leads in front of him. The public was already on edge, and if word of a serial killer targeting Gotham's elite spread, it would set off a panic the city couldn't afford. Gordon trusted Batman, but that trust was starting to wear thin as the case dragged on. Every time they seemed close to a breakthrough, the trail went cold, and the pressure mounted. He could feel it. The weight of the city's power brokers pressing down on him, demanding results, threatening his career if he couldn't deliver. But Batman wasn't about to let the trail go cold. He knew where to look next. In the depths of Gotham's underworld, there were whispers of a contract, a hit that had been offered to a notorious killer. Victor Zsasz, the sadistic hitman who marked his own body with a scar for every life he took, had recently been approached. Someone had wanted Zsasz to carry out the murders of Delacour and Vale. But Zsasz, as twisted as he was, hadn't taken the job. Not because he wasn't interested, but because something about the offer felt wrong to him. And if there was one thing Zsasz hated, it was being manipulated. Deep within the bowels of Arkham, Batman found Zsasz, caged but far from broken. The scars that covered his body were a testament to his madness. But behind his eyes was a glimmer of dangerous intelligence. Zsasz knew the game, and while he relished in death, he wouldn't be anyone's pawn. Batman pressed him for answers, but Zsasz wasn't the killer. He was certain of that. Still, Zsasz revealed something critical. Someone else had approached him. Someone who wanted to frame him, to make him the fall guy for a much larger conspiracy. Whoever was behind these murders wasn't just a killer. They were a master manipulator, playing Gotham's deadliest game from behind the scenes. As Batman left Arkham, the weight of the truth began to settle in. This wasn't just a serial killer. This was something far worse. A carefully orchestrated plot designed to take down Gotham's elite, piece by piece. And at the center of it all was someone far more calculating than Zsasz, someone who understood Gotham's darkest secrets. Batman knew that the rose petal was just the beginning. He would have to dig deeper. The real killer was still out there, and the game was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The Garden of Silence. Gotham's skyline was obscured by low-hanging clouds, their edges tinged with the pale light of the city below. The night was unusually still, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for something inevitable. Batman crouched on the ledge of a skyscraper, the cold wind pulling at his cape. Below, Gotham churned on, oblivious to the darkness that had been creeping through its veins, waiting to bloom. His investigation had taken him deeper into the tangled web of corruption that surrounded Serapax, the psychiatric drug that had already claimed too many lives. Now, as he stared at the encrypted files pulled from Martha Delacourt's computer, a clearer picture was beginning to emerge. A picture that revealed something far more sinister than mere corporate greed. The files were dense, heavily encoded, but Batman had already cracked the first layer of encryption. Hidden beneath mundane business records and company emails was a project, an experiment so carefully buried that even the most powerful in Gotham had gone to great lengths to erase its existence. The project was called the Garden of Silence, a chilling reference to the secret trials that Delacour and her allies had overseen. Serapax had not just been a flawed drug, it had been a weapon. The files revealed the horrific details of an experiment that used Serapax to induce a permanent state of catatonia in patients. The goal had been to create compliant, emotionless subjects, people stripped of their free will, capable of being controlled with nothing more than a whisper. The patients had been prisoners, homeless citizens, and those deemed undesirable by Gotham's elite, people who wouldn't be missed. The experiment had been a grotesque violation of human dignity, and it had been done in secret, without oversight, in facilities hidden from the public eye. And at the center of it all was a name Batman had encountered before: Dr. Evelyn Cornell. The disgraced psychiatrist who had once been a leading figure in psychiatric research had faked her death to escape prosecution. She had disappeared after her unethical practices were exposed, vanishing without a trace. Now, operating under the alias The Gardener, Cornell had resurfaced with a singular purpose: revenge. The files made it clear that Delacour had been one of the key players in the Garden of Silence, but she had not acted alone. There were others who had profited from the experiment, others who had ensured its secrecy, even as the bodies of the victims piled up. Cornell had been betrayed by the very system she had once served, and now she was methodically dismantling it from within. Every murder, every victim, was part of a carefully orchestrated plan, retribution for the role they had played in destroying her career and condemning her research. The rose petal left at each crime scene was no mere flourish. It was a symbol, Cornell's calling card. The gardener was cultivating her vengeance with meticulous care, using her botanical knowledge to leave cryptic clues that only someone like Batman could decipher. Each murder had been a piece of a larger puzzle, each death a step closer to the final act of her macabre plan. Batman's mind raced as he reviewed the evidence. Cornell had been hiding in plain sight, her botanical expertise woven into her new identity as the gardener. She had chosen her victims carefully, each one tied to the Serapax scandal, each one responsible in some way for the lives that had been destroyed by the Garden of Silence. But there was more to Cornell's plan. Her cryptic clues suggested something grander, something far more devastating than a string of murders. The clues she had left behind, references to rare plants, flowers that bloomed only in darkness, symbols of silence and death, pointed to an impending climax. Batman had to admit, reluctantly, that he admired the way she had crafted her revenge. There was no randomness to her actions, no chaos. Each murder had been calculated, and each symbol had meaning. She wasn't just avenging her past, she was exposing the rotting core of Gotham's elite, forcing them to reckon with their sins. The weight of it pressed against him. This was more than a battle against a single villain. Cornell's vendetta was a mirror held up to the very corruption that had allowed Gotham to become what it was. It forced Batman to confront his own limitations. He could fight crime, he could defeat villains, but could he truly cleanse Gotham of the deep-seated rot that had festered in its highest ranks? Cornell's actions were criminal, but her targets were far from innocent. In a way, she was holding Gotham's elite accountable in the most brutal way possible. As he pieced together her next move, a cold realization struck him. Cornell's pattern, her cryptic references to plants and their meanings, it wasn't just random botanical knowledge, it was personal. The roses, the silence, the precision of each strike, it was all building toward a final target, someone who had played a pivotal role in bringing down the Garden of Silence, someone whose investigation had exposed the Sarapax scandal and destroyed Cornell's career. Jim Gordon. The files confirmed it. Gordon's task force had been instrumental in uncovering the truth about Sarapax, leading to the collapse of the experiment and the ruin of Cornell's professional life. Her revenge wasn't just aimed at the business leaders who had betrayed her, it was aimed at the law enforcement figures who had exposed her. Batman's pulse quickened. Cornell's plan was nearly complete, and if he didn't move quickly, Gordon would be her next victim. The symbolic retribution would be perfect in Cornell's eyes, taking down the man who had brought her to justice, silencing him in the most permanent way possible. The gardener had been patient, methodical, but now her grand finale was within reach. As the wind howled around him, Batman rose from his crouch, his cape billowing out behind him like the wings of a great shadow. He had no time to lose. Cornell was moving quickly, and Gotham's streets were about to be bathed in more than just the cold light of winter. This time, the stakes were personal. Chapter 4. In the Garden's Shadow. The wind howled through Gotham's Narrows, a decaying section of the city long forgotten by those who lived in the glittering towers above. Down here, where the streets were narrow and winding, the buildings were crumbling relics of a past age, their skeletal frames leaning precariously as if the very earth beneath them was losing the will to hold them up. The cold air was thick with the smell of decay and damp, a fitting backdrop for the twisted culmination of Dr. Evelyn Cornell's plans. In the heart of the Narrows, hidden behind layers of urban blight, lay the place Batman had been searching for, the abandoned greenhouse. Once a lush, thriving botanical facility, it now stood as a decayed monument to Cornell's early work, a place where she had honed her knowledge of psychotropics and plant-based neurotoxins. The greenhouse's glass panes were cracked and grimy, vines snaked through the gaps, and the air inside was thick with a suffocating humidity, despite the winter chill outside. This was Cornell's lair, where she had retreated to after faking her death, and where she had been perfecting her latest weapon, a psychotropic gas derived from the same research that birthed Sarapax. Batman's approach was silent, his movements deliberate as he navigated the shadowed ruins of the Narrows. His mind raced, piecing together the fragmented trail Cornell had left behind. The encrypted files from Delacour's computer had led him here, to this decaying greenhouse. The final piece of Cornell's puzzle was about to fall into place, and Batman knew time was running out. Gordon was in danger, and if he didn't act quickly, Cornell would make him the next victim in her twisted re-education campaign. The greenhouse loomed before him, its rusted iron framework tangled with overgrown vegetation. Inside, the remnants of Cornell's experiments lingered. Rows of wilted plants, shattered glass vials, and strange machines humming quietly in the dark. Cornell had always been drawn to the delicate balance between nature and control, between life and the manipulation of the mind. Now, in this place, she had perfected her vision of control, and Batman knew that he was walking directly into her trap. The air inside the greenhouse was thick with the scent of damp earth and something far more sinister, a faint, acrid odor that clung to the back of his throat as soon as he stepped inside. Batman had prepared for this, knowing that Cornell's weapon would be her psychotropic gas, but no amount of preparation could fully shield him from its effects. As he moved deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the greenhouse, the gas began to take hold, its invisible tendrils winding their way into his mind, manipulating his senses. At first, it was subtle, a faint distortion in the periphery of his vision, a shifting of shadows that seemed out of place. But soon, the hallucinations began in earnest. Gotham's corruption bled through the walls of his mind, vivid and nightmarish. He saw the faces of the city's elite, twisted and monstrous, laughing as they profited from the suffering of the innocent. He saw Gordon, chained to the system, unable to escape the suffocating grip of bureaucracy and political pressure. And worst of all, he saw himself, Batman, standing amidst the darkness, powerless to stop it. The visions pressed against his will, each one more terrible than the last, forcing him to confront the deepest fears he harbored about Gotham's future. The city was a rot, and no matter how many criminals he stopped, how many villains he defeated, the core of Gotham's soul remained poisoned. The gas wormed its way deeper, manipulating his emotions, turning his doubts into weapons against him. Cornell had engineered it to break the strongest minds, and now Batman was caught in its grip, his mental discipline pushed to its limits. But Batman wasn't just any mind. He had trained for years to withstand psychological attacks, honing his mental resilience through countless trials. He forced his thoughts into focus, pushing the hallucinations to the edges of his consciousness. The corruption of Gotham, the twisted reflections of his own fears, these were the weapons Cornell had crafted to break him. But they would not. Batman was more than a product of his city's darkness. He was its counterbalance. Step by step, he forced his way through the greenhouse, his body moving even as his mind waged war against the gas. The path ahead blurred and twisted, but he pressed on, his every breath drawing him closer to Cornell. He knew she was somewhere in the heart of this place, waiting for him, waiting for her moment of triumph. And then he saw her. Dr. Evelyn Cornell, the gardener, stood amidst a collection of strange, blooming plants, their petals glowing faintly under the dim light of the greenhouse. She had transformed since her disappearance, no longer the disgraced psychiatrist, but something far more dangerous. Her once clinical demeanor had given way to a kind of manic devotion, her eyes gleaming with the fervor of someone who believed they had found the truth, no matter how twisted that truth had become. Behind her, Gordon was bound to a chair, his face pale but defiant. Cornell had already begun the next phase of her plan. Her new version of Serapax, delivered as a psychotropic gas, was designed not just to incapacitate but to reprogram the minds of its victims, bending them to her vision of a perfect society. Gotham's corruption, in her mind, could only be fixed by tearing down its moral figures and remolding them in her image. Gordon, the man who had once exposed her crimes, would become her first subject, a symbol of what Gotham could be under her control. As Batman fought through the haze of the gas, Cornell taunted him, her voice echoing through the greenhouse like the rustling of dead leaves. She believed she was on the verge of victory. Gordon would be re-educated, Batman broken by his own fears, and Gotham would finally be cleansed. In her mind, she was the savior the city needed. But Batman wasn't done yet. Through sheer force of will, he pushed back the hallucinations, his vision sharpening as he focused on the present. He could feel the gas still clawing at his mind, but he had no time to waste. He moved, faster than Cornell expected, dodging the vines and obstacles she had placed in his path. The fight was brutal, a battle not just of strength, but of wits. Cornell's mind was her greatest weapon, and she wielded it with precision. But Batman had faced worse. He fought through the hallucinations, the gas still twisting his perception, until he was face to face with her. Cornell, for all her intellect, hadn't anticipated the depths of his resilience. But even as he reached her, Batman was faced with an impossible choice. The gas was still spreading, and Cornell's plan, her grand design to remake Gotham, was moments away from completion. If he didn't stop it now, more than just Gordon would be lost. But if he chose to stop Cornell's plan, Gordon would be left defenseless, and Cornell's re-education would claim him. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. Time slowed, the consequences of his choice looming like shadows. Save Gordon or stop the plan? Both outcomes seemed untenable. And in that moment, as the gas thickened around him and the city's fate hung in the balance, Batman realized that the true cost of Cornell's twisted vision wasn't just Gotham's soul, it was the burden of choice. And it was a choice only he could make. Chapter 5. Many More Gardens. The greenhouse was crumbling, its rusted iron beams groaning under the weight of years of neglect. Beneath the shattered panes of glass, Batman stood alone in the heart of Cornell's twisted creation, breathing in the toxic air that hung thick with the remnants of her psychotropic gas. His body ached, weakened from the hallucinations that still clawed at the edges of his consciousness. But his mind, sharpened by years of discipline, refused to yield. Ahead of him, in the center of the overgrown chamber, Dr. Evelyn Cornell waited. She stood over Gordon, who was bound and motionless, his fate hanging by a thread as Cornell made the final adjustments to the device that would release her mind-altering gas across Gotham. A series of canisters, interconnected by tubes and valves, formed a crude machine designed to spread her toxin to the city's elite, the people she deemed responsible for Gotham's decay. The leaders of industry, politics, and law enforcement, they were all in her sights, ready to be re-educated by the same drug that had destroyed so many lives. Batman moved, every step measured, the weight of the choice he'd faced only moments before still lingering in his mind. Gordon had been at the brink of reprogramming, but Batman had managed to free him just in time. Now, with the last of his strength, he had to end this. Cornell's operation, her vision of Gotham as a garden of obedient minds, had to be dismantled. The air hummed with tension, the greenhouse itself seeming to hold its breath. Cornell's plan was in its final stage, the culmination of years of hidden work and unbridled revenge. She had been wronged by Gotham's elite, betrayed and discarded when her experiments were exposed, but now she stood on the verge of exacting her revenge in the most calculated way possible. The gas, once released, would sweep through the city's power structures, reshaping the minds of those who controlled Gotham. It wasn't just about vengeance, it was about remaking the city in her image, one where control was absolute, where free will was a distant memory. But Batman saw the cracks in her plan, even in her mind. Her brilliance was undeniable, but her ideology, her vision, was built on the very corruption she claimed to despise. Cornell's obsession with control, with bending others to her will, made her no different from the elite she sought to punish. She was blind to the chaos she would unleash, to the countless lives that would be destroyed in her pursuit of a perfect society. The battle between them was swift and brutal. Batman's movements, though slowed by the lingering effects of the gas, were precise, calculated. Cornell fought with the desperation of someone who believed herself moments away from victory, but she was no match for his skill and resolve. Even as her psychotropic toxins played tricks on his mind, distorting reality, Batman fought through the hallucinations, the twisted images of Gotham's corruption, of his own failures, blurred and faded as his will overpowered the effects of the gas. In the end, Cornell fell, her plan unraveling as Batman dismantled the machine she had so carefully constructed. The canisters hissed as the gas was contained, its release prevented by mere seconds. Gotham, for the moment, was safe. But as Batman stood over Cornell, her defeated form crumpled on the floor, she turned her eyes to him, a haunting smile playing across her lips. Her voice, hoarse from the struggle, carried a quiet intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "There are many more gardens yet to bloom," she said, her words lingering in the air like the faint scent of roses. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Cornell was arrested, her operations shut down, and the GCPD moved quickly to clean up the remnants of her twisted project. But even as they carted her away, the weight of her warning settled over Batman like a shroud. Gotham had survived this night, but Cornell's ideology had taken root in the city's shadows. The Sarapak's disaster had exposed the rot at Gotham's core, the complicity of its leaders in experiments that violated every moral code. Cornell's revenge had been aimed at them, and in her own twisted way, she had succeeded in unmasking their sins. As dawn approached, Gotham stirred back to life, unaware of how close it had come to disaster. The elite would recover, but the city would never be the same. The Sarapak scandal had left a scar on Gotham, one that would not heal easily. And Cornell's ideology, her belief that Gotham's soul was so deeply corrupted that it needed to be controlled, reshaped, haunted both Batman and Gordon. They had won the battle, but the war for Gotham's future was far from over. Standing on the roof of GCPD headquarters, Batman watched as the bat signal faded against the early morning light. Gordon, shaken but resolute, had returned to his post, his mind still reeling from Cornell's near indoctrination. The gas may not have claimed him, but the weight of the truth had left its mark. Gotham was a city built on secrets, on power and greed, and Cornell had only pulled back the veil on a small part of that darkness. As Batman turned to leave, something fluttered in the air, catching the pale light of the rising sun. A single rose petal, drifting down from the sky, landed at his feet. It was an impossible thing. Cornell was in custody, her operation dismantled. But the petal was real, and it carried with it the unmistakable message that Gotham's nightmares were not yet over. There were many more gardens left to bloom, and Batman knew he would have to be ready for whatever grew from the shadows next.